Well, it's finally over. We're past the election. We know who the next president of the United States is going to be. Things were quite smooth in Florida, and Republicans really owned the day, not only in the Sunshine State, but all across the nation. Today's special guest, my old friend, University of Florida political science professor Dan Smith. Dan is going to join me for an early dive into some key takeaways from Tuesday night's election. Who turned up, who didn't turn out. And we talk about ballot initiatives and what's in store for the Democrats. So much more. Please join me and University of Florida political science professor Dan Smith.
This was a uniform shift. We saw it across all counties in Florida. We saw it across all jurisdictions where Trump did better. Rick Scott did better. Rick Scott, a guy who can barely win an election, did the best he's ever done.
You're listening to Deeper Dive with Dara, a podcast by the News Service of Florida. Let's dive in.
I don't know about y'all, but I am really tuckered out. And yet, I'm very, very excited to have with us today to try to help make some sense of what happened this week. One of my OGs, you guys tired of hearing me say it, University of Florida political science professor Daniel Smith. Welcome to Deeper Dive.
Well, great to be on your show. Big admirer, Dara.
You're sweet to say so. You are sweet to say so. Thank you very much. Do we want to start with who you are and what you're doing, or do we want to start with what the hell happened Tuesday night?
Well, I think those are probably combined, is that clearly I don't know what the hell is going on or what I'm doing. It's Florida. We may no longer be a battleground state, which is somewhat sad with respect to having the rest of the United States look at Florida and what's going to happen and who's going to win the presidency with 539 votes in the balance or whatnot back in 2000, or the competitive elections that we had and the historic elections in 2008 and 2012. And I thought I had a little more sense of what's going on in Florida, but this past election has clearly shown that this is not a purple state, and we can talk about why that might be, how this shift has happened, but I think it's undeniable now. And I don't know whether political scientists more generally know really what's going on with this uniform shift that we saw not only in Florida, but across the country with respect to Trump doing so much better than he did in 2020. Pretty remarkable shift indeed from 2016 in Florida for Trump. Which he won the state, but just cleaned up.
Sure, he won. I was looking at a little bit of the numbers, and yes, let's talk about all of that because, when you look at that map of the country, it is very red. And, we still have pockets of blue, but I was just writing about this morning. Trump won Florida by about 3 percentage points 4 years ago and 13 percentage points. So how about that? That is a exponential jump.
I don't think anyone would have predicted that in 2016, certainly. I don't know if anyone would have predicted it in 2020. And it's everywhere. It's not only in the more purple counties in Florida, it's not only in the blue counties, the few that remain, it's in even the deepest red counties in Florida that became even more Trump supporting this time around. And that to me, that's difficult to do. And I think it's difficult to do unless you look at the other side of the coin, which is not necessarily the Democrats were supporting Trump. There's very little evidence that was going on. It's the Democrats didn't turn out again in Florida, And no party affiliates clearly broke for Trump, as well as other Republican candidates up and down the ballot. So to take this whole story that this is all about the issues, we have lots of evidence to suggest that that's not the case. But this is something where the Democratic Party has got more than soul searching to do, is whether they even have a soul. I think they are in a really tough place here in Florida. It was a tough place 4 years ago. It was a tough place maybe even 8 years ago. But where has that Democratic Party gone from 2008 and 2012, and as well as in midterm elections, 2018? That was a razor-thin election for governor when Ron DeSantis squeaked by Andrew Gillum. So, there's so much that has happened, but it hasn't happened just in one place. And I think that makes it even more difficult and more interesting to try to tease apart, not only for the Democratic operatives who have really a lot of work to do, but for political scientists to say it's not just one particular demographic group that either didn't turn out or may have been persuaded to cross party lines. It is everywhere. And that, as I said, this uniform shift makes it really difficult to kind of pinpoint what's the road ahead for the Democratic Party in this state.
Because you've got, supposedly it was going to be women. You've got a gender gap. Do we have any data yet on the gender gap?
There's definitely a gender gap. Is the gender gap as large in Florida as the rest of the country? No. That's very clear. But there is a gender gap, and women were more likely to be supportive of Kamala Harris, but not by much in Florida, as opposed to in other states. And again, there are possible reasons for this. One of the things that I've been playing around with, Dara, is that 20 years ago, I was writing almost exclusively on ballot measures.
Right, that's how we first got to know each other.
First met.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. And we were looking, I think it was in 2004 or so, when the legislature in Florida was starting to crack down on the initiative process. They didn't like these ballot measures that seemed to have a progressive flavor to them passing. Meanwhile, Jeb Bush and Republicans were solidifying their control on state government in Tallahassee. But back then, I wrote a book called Educated by Initiative, and that book came out in 2004. It was looking at data from the 1990s and early 2000s. I wrote it with Carolyn Tolbert, a professor at the University of Iowa. And, we were pretty convinced, and the data suggested that ballot measures mobilize people to the polls, but they also can be kind of a persuasive element to getting people primed to think about candidates through those issues that are forefront and center to the opportunity to make policy. And so you can kind of think about these issues that, I'm in favor of banning smoking in public places, or I'm in favor of reducing class sizes. And I see the Democratic Party is all on top of those issues. And I'm thinking about those issues, and it's now thinking about those candidates who have identified themselves. Maybe it's minimum wage, as we had in 2004 on the ballot. Passed with 71% of the vote. But that's when I started to think, this is detaching some, and it's allowing voters to separate the issues that are important to them by having them on the ballot, and then keeping their partisan moorings to the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. I think that has just exploded with respect to the polarization that we've had in this country, with Republicans not only feeling stronger about their party, but really despising Democrats and Democratic candidates, and vice versa. That it's not quite as strong, but it's pretty true as well. And so those issues now give voters an opportunity to say, I'm going to have my cake and eat it too. I'm a female, suburban, white, educated voter in Florida. We do have some who's going to vote for Republicans.
He's so sly. It was so deadpan. So deadpan, Dan. Deadpan Dan.
Well, we're allowed to do that, I think, in class. We just can't give our opinions in class anymore. So, if you're deadpan, they don't really know if you're giving your opinion or not. So, you have those voters. And in the past, they may have said, look, here's this issue. I know that Democrats support a woman's right to choose, I'm going to vote for Amendment 4. I'm also going to vote for the Democratic nominees for either president or for U.S. Senate or down ballot, because I'm concerned that they may have quote unquote devious plans like Jeb Bush did when the class size measure was passing, that he was going to defeat it some other way. But now I don't see that as much. I have to dig into the data. It's going to take a while before we get the returns. But I am pretty convinced that we had people who were voting on issues. It's not possible otherwise. What? Amendment 4 didn't pass, but it got 57% of the vote.
Correct.
Right? And Harris gets, what did you say earlier? 41%?
Yeah, I was just looking at it. It was a little less than 43%.
Yeah, 43%. So it's clear that people were voting a policy that is completely at odds with the Republican Party here in Florida. And who the hell knows what Trump believes? He said everything under the sun in terms of what his real position is on this. But that partisan polarization is so strong today that I think it's really difficult for voters to think about those issues and identify with a political party who clearly has identified itself with that issue, the Democratic Party.
You know what, in that, let's talk a little bit about the Amendment 4 proposal. That was the one that would have enshrined abortion rights in the state constitution. They went very hard. The supporters of that amendment went very hard on this is not a partisan proposal. They were always with they had Republicans speaking in favor of it. That was part of their game plan. This is, obviously the Democrats supported it. That's probably why it did as well as it did, looking at Kamala Harris's numbers here and looking at the performance of Democrats really up and down the ballot. I had Beth Matuga on here a couple weeks ago. She runs House Democratic campaigns. She told me they had tiers of races, but they had 5 seats they wanted to protect and 5 seats they wanted to pick up. They needed to pick up 5 seats in order to undo the Republicans' supermajority in the House. Now, whether they could actually do all that, was questionable. They lost 2 seats and picked up 1 seat, so it was a net gain of 1 seat for the Republicans. So how did they get there?
Yeah, so I was looking at that. I guess it's hard to say that any of this is a victory, but we can talk about those House races because I think it's pretty fascinating.
Yeah.
I was looking earlier at the Democratic Party's Take Back Florida Distinction program, right? This is where Nikki Fried, the FDP chair, was highlighting and targeting these races, infusing them with money, many of which Beth was working on.
Right.
And one individual won the race that they were targeting. Leonard Spencer in Florida House District 45. Against a indicted member of the state legislature.
Yes.
Yeah. And it was close. It may go to recount. I'm not even sure.
I'm not sure if it's past that yet. I don't know. But yeah.
One. But I was looking at that list, and this is, where do the Democrats go? Well, in some ways, with the we're talking about the Republican supermajority and getting it down from a supermajority. We're not talking about Democrats taking over the House. That's one thing that we have to be really clear about.
Right?
I mean, that's kind of mind-numbing to think that a victory would have knocked out the supermajority as opposed to even coming close to parity of 120 seats.
Correct.
But if you look at those races, there were a lot that were pretty close. They were within 2 or 3 or 4 percentage points. Mm-hmm. I call those fairly close. And we're going to have a midterm election coming up. All of those seats are going to be up again. These Democratic candidates now have some experience. They've got name recognition. They've been able to raise some money. And we know that the electorate is going to be different. We know the Trump-only voters are not going to be coming out. And the same type of force that they came out this year or in 2020 or certainly in 2016 when they really came out to vote. the first time. They've come out again. It's really interesting to see, this pattern of the infrequent Republican voters coming out. They're not going to come out in 2026.
Yes.
They didn't come out in 2022.
Yeah, they had, we had about, I think it was like 3 or 4 million fewer voter. I can't remember off the top of my head, but there are quite a few fewer.
Yeah, we go down almost a third of the total vote. And so that gives an opportunity for the Democrats to pick up some of these seats that are only competitive because Republicans really wanted to make, through the gerrymandering process, more seats that they could win to get to that supermajority, which meant that they could only shove so many Democrats into safe districts. They had to leave some that were closer to 50-50, depending on what kind of wave election it is. Now, we could have a major blue wave election if Trump's administration just goes down the tubes and people are frustrated, they come out, and it doesn't matter whether the state government and a federalist system has nothing to do with the federal government. People are going to think about state races through that partisan lens that they're thinking about the federal government. So it could have some effect. It didn't happen this election, and largely it's because this is a general election, presidential election that should be turning out Democrats, and Democrats just didn't come out in the same type of numbers.
And do we have any idea why not? Was it that Kamala Harris came into the race too late? Is it that we've had this new demographic of voters moving into Florida? Is it that the Republicans have done a really good job at registering voters? Is it that changes in election law have, impacted? What is the reason? Because Dan, I've been doing this for 100,000 years, and every 4 years or every 2 years, usually it's every 4 years, the Democrats say it's all about turnout, turnout, turnout. And if we can get them to turn out, and they have all these different strategies, and they have all these different food groups that are doing, I can't tell you how many over the years, how many emails I'm getting we did this gazillion door knocks. Are they not targeting the right people? Where did all the Democrats go? Why aren't they voting?
It's a lot of what you just mentioned. There have clearly been changes to the law starting in 2021 with Senate Bill 90, followed with Senate Bill 524, followed by Senate Bill 7050, that have made it more difficult for voters to register who do not go to the DMV or who do not go online. And a lot of people don't do either of those things because they don't have the requisite identification to do that, or they don't go to the DMV because they don't drive. They don't have a car. There's no reason to do that. We know from
particularly people in urban areas who might tend, I don't want to generalize, but that's maybe more urban voters, right?
Absolutely. And we know who they are because in the litigation, the Secretary of State's office had to turn over to experts, and I served as an expert in the Senate Bill 90 as well as the Senate Bill 7050 litigation. And so we know exactly who these individuals are from records that are not generally shared with respect to how they register to vote. And Black and Hispanic voters in Florida, 1 in 10 registered to vote most recently, either new or updating the registration through a third-party voter registration organization.
Right.
White individuals, it was 2%. So 5 times more. And we're talking here about close to 800,000 individuals who most recently engaged with respect to updating or registering anew with 3PVROs. 3PVROs have effectively been eliminated.
3PVRO, for those of you who aren't in the know, one of the cool kids like we are, is a third-party voter registration organization, and you'll hear that a lot because that's what they are.
That's what they are, and the state actually refers to them that way as well.
Yes.
Yeah, and they have done a very effective job, meaning the Republican state legislature and Governor DeSantis, in regulating these organizations. Think League of Women Voters, think Rock the Vote, think the organizations that are on, at the canvassing tables at your supermarket or at a community event or on college campuses. They really, with very few exceptions, and Askamani organization is one of them, because the fines, the penalties are so great if you make a mistake. And it's easy to make mistakes. People don't always have their accurate information when they're providing to, and yet you have to provide those forms in and have them validated. And if they're not, you're facing really serious fines. So that's one thing. Does that explain everything? No, no way. It does explain why the gap between the Republican Party registrants and the Democratic Party registrants has increased, but probably an equal, if not more, reason for that, and I'm just starting to do some research on this, which is pretty cool, is looking at where people are coming from.
Right.
To this free state of Florida.
That's right.
You know? And we've always had, I had a colleague, David Colburn, he was the former provost. He was a great historian at the University of Florida, terrific guy. And, he said, this is still true, about 1,000 people a day are moving to Florida. If you look at the census data, there are lots of bodies going back up to Cincinnati after they expire here in Florida. But we are a state that there is a lot of immigration.
Yes.
It's coming from, the Northeast, the Midwest,
yes.
But increasingly the central part of the country as well. And I have data that I took a long time to do all this coding. I've got some great students at the University of Florida, really smart data science students that I've been working with. And we've been curating this data in terms of where people were born. And so not everyone puts down where they were born when they're registering to vote in Florida, but we've got about 2 million people where we know where they are. And I can see very clearly from these trends of registration dates when people registered to vote in Florida. And I can see quite clearly that back in 2010, 2012, it was almost on par in terms of voters coming from New York or from Pennsylvania or from Wisconsin or Illinois who were coming to Florida and who were registering in equal numbers, Republican and Democrat, and maybe a little fewer with no party affiliation. And since 2018, we have seen this incredible divergence where Republicans now, who have moved by definition, because I know they are registering in, say, 2019 or 2020, I know they were born elsewhere. I'm pretty sure that they haven't been living in Florida under a rock for the last 10 years and didn't register. So there's some assumptions here. But you can see quite clearly that these lines are expanding the difference between Republican registrations anew and Democratic registrations in these last 6 years. And, it's really clear from places like Massachusetts. People who used to come to Florida who were Democrats are not moving to Florida from Massachusetts. It's just the data speaks volumes.
That's really interesting.
And it's so I'm working on this paper, and hopefully we'll have something more. But it's the first time ever looking kind of at this dynamic and kind of what we all intuitively know.
Right. It's what the governor says. I think it's what the governor says, right? Absolutely. That he's got a mandate, and that he's made Florida, the free state of Florida, attractive to people, and this is who's moving here. And I'll tell you just anecdotally, I have family members who are very conservative who love DeSantis, and he is a rock star, and they all want to move down here from where? Philadelphia area and New Jersey. Yeah. Hey, and then I have my other family members who are hardcore Democrats who live in New York half the year and in South Florida half the year, are thinking about not coming back down to South Florida half the year, but for the weather.
It's a real thing. It's a real thing. And so that's another dynamic that has led to that gap, right? Does that explain everything in terms of this shift? No, I think there are other factors. The factors that when you have one party that has monopoly control over all the levers of government, where they use their threats of funding or defunding or, my goodness, preemption of state government. We're feeling that here in Gainesville.
I know,
with our local utility.
Yeah.
It's remarkable that it was one thing to kind of change it and take over the board, and now the threats to dissolve the city of Gainesville?
Yeah. Ask Key West how they feel about that. Ask Key West how they feel about that.
And it's the same kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
You've taken state preemption. Yes, cities are entities of the state government. We know that. But there's also this thing called home rule.
Or ask Disney.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or Disney. Right. Disney knows that very well. They just have the resources to be able to fight it.
That's right.
So, it's really quite frightening to think how you're going to do this. We'll look at the firing of state district attorneys, state attorneys.
Correct. Yes.
Right? I mean, removing them from office, removing school board members from office. That is something that, is really demoralizing to a lot of folks. And you think, well, why does my vote matter? Even if we, are able to win some local seats, honestly, it's an unfair field that we're playing on right now.
The state attorney races were interesting to me because I really expected Andrew Warren to win. And he not only lost, but Susie Lopez, the hand-picked selection by Governor DeSantis to replace him, won handily. And, the governor, I'm not under the same restrictions as you, but I'm a reporter. I do news reporting. I don't do editorial reporting. Sometimes when I'm on the podcast, I feel more, I have more liberties, but, I try to be unbiased and fair. I think I'm known for that in my reporting. I will say that the DeSantis has done campaign style events clearly on Amendments 3 and 4. He appeared in the last couple of weeks at events with Susie Lopez down in Hillsborough County that appeared like campaign style events, but they were not. They were on, I forget what, maybe he had her on one of these like anti-weed things that he was doing. I can't remember specifically. So that one I was a little surprised because of the voter composition there. And yet Monique Worrell, she got reelected. So
very wide margins. They were almost flipped.
I know. And that's Osceola and Orange counties, Osceola and Orange. And so that to me, it was just like head scratching that one and the other. You know what I mean?
I agree completely. And I really thought that Warren was going to win that seat back.
Me too.
I thought it was going to be a platform for him running for governor.
I did too. Or attorney general.
Yeah. I mean, he has those ambitions. And to see that remarkable defeat, I don't know what explains it. Because although, look at Luna's reelection bid.
That was very interesting to me too. I'll tell you what, when I was I'm in the office late on election night, and I used to be Esgo Pasco goes the nation on a presidential race. Pasco now has become much more conservative, much redder than it used to be. So now I feel like one of the last really truly swing areas in Florida is Pinellas. And when I saw that President Trump won Pinellas, I said, okay, Dara, you can go home now. It was around midnight. I was like, okay, you can go to sleep now because I think you know what I mean? Like that to me, that's my little rule of thumb, and I'm sticking by it.
Well, you stuck out an hour and a half longer than I did. I went to bed at 10:30. I said, stick a fork in this thing. This is done.
Yeah.
Looking at just the turnout, I could kind of tell from looking at the early votes numbers, and we can talk about that too. Because I think that kind of falls into a lot of what we're talking about of what's going on and these rules. It's amazing.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the rule changes, right?
Let's do that.
Senate Bill 90 did lots of things. I mean, it cracked down on third-party voter registration organizations. This is the
He really hates Senate Bill 90, in case you didn't know.
This thing came out. It was really...
I covered all that litigation. I read all your... You did a lot of...
a lot of expert reporting on that.
Yeah.
And that's the one, actually, that Governor DeSantis or someone told the University of Florida, we don't really like you're a professor working outside, a second job, quote unquote.
That's right.
Doing this. So that
Oh,
was
I
what
forgot
triggered-
about that.
Yeah,
Right.
that's what triggered the litigation where we had to sue the University of
You
Florida
did.
to let me and my two colleagues who were also
Sharon
working on that
and
case. Yeah, Sharon and Mike.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that is a very important piece of legislation, and we had some victories.
And
It
you
was
were
also difficult.
successful in that.
In some in some of the areas.
No, I
but
mean in being allowed to testify.
we were finally, we had, I think, $1.3 million of pro bono legal counsel coming from
Okay.
a great DC firm. We still owe our local attorney over $400,000 that the University of Florida hasn't paid up because they keep appealing.
Oh my gosh.
So,
okay, well,
yeah,
we digress.
Yes.
Yes.
So, thinking about SB 90, it put all these regulations on voting by mail. Recall that 2020 was the pandemic elections, the August primary and the general election under the coronavirus. And Democrats, particularly African Americans, over 50% higher turnout of African Americans using vote by mail ballots. African Americans typically in Florida have used early in-person voting. We had souls of the polls. We remember what happened in that case in 2008.
Yes.
After this massive souls of the polls on the final Sunday of early in-person voting, what did the Republican legislature do in 2011? They passed House Bill 1355.
They shit-canned Sunday voting before.
They killed off the final Sunday.
Yeah.
They shrunk it from 14 to 8 days. And lo and
I
behold,
actually broke a story about that when I was working for the Palm Beach Post, that was intentionally done. You would use the word suppress or, to lower the black turnout in that election.
And it worked.
Yeah.
It worked. And, I've done some other studies where we have actually observational data from 2012. You'll love this. So remember, early voting ended on that final Saturday, not the Sunday.
Right.
Because it was eliminated. And so African American mobilization, Obama, which was running the campaign operation for turnout, not the Democratic Party. And that's another issue that I wanted to get back to.
Yes.
In terms of what's going on.
Good.
But, they were running the operation, and there was a souls to the polls on a Saturday. And lines were so long, if you recall, in that 2012 election, including in Palm Beach, but mostly down in Miami-Dade and Broward, that the administrative data that I was able to get through public records requests actually showed that there were thousands of people who voted on Sunday, the day that was banned.
Wow.
Because they were in line.
Because they had waited
at
so
7
long.
p.m.
Wow.
Earlier. And so they had, by definition, been in line at least 5 hours.
Wow.
Because you have to be in line at the time polls closed
Right.
at 7 p.m.
Right.
And they were disproportionately black and Hispanic voters.
Right.
Right. So these are the kind of things. Well, Republicans cracked down on early voting because African Americans were using. 2020, African Americans start to use vote by mail very
Right.
effectively. And what do we see? A crackdown on vote by mail, of having additional information that you have to have in order to be able to request a vote by mail. It's mind-boggling that you do not, under federal law, you do not have to have a social security number, which doesn't define you as a citizen, by the way. Non-citizens have social security numbers.
That's correct.
So, but you have to have now a social security number if you want to register to vote online, or if you want to access a vote by mail ballot, request a vote by mail ballot online, you have to have your social security number and a driver's license or a state ID. Again, not required to vote in Florida. So you can vote in person still in Florida without having either of those two pieces of information, but you can't request a vote by mail ballot if you don't have it. And again, that litigation revealed that there were something like 3 million out of the then 15 million or so people who didn't have a social security number and driver's license on file because it wasn't required when they registered prior to 2006 with Real ID. So, again, they cracked down on this because they knew who it was going to affect disproportionately. And what do we see? We see African Americans moving over and continuing to vote by mail in 2022. And suddenly, now that these laws in effect, in force in 2024, we see a decrease again in this. And what do Republicans, who dominated vote by mail They dominated in the 1990s and 2000s. They have shifted dramatically. And these numbers are quite remarkable. So I've been tallying these numbers if you want.
I do. I want to see, because I want to remind our listeners, again, they're a very sophisticated group of individuals. I do want to remind our listeners that we have had vote by mail. We used to call it absentee voting in Florida for a very long time. And it is the mechanism that Republicans largely relied on as they gained control of the state house and the cabinet level positions. It was very popular for many years, right? For Republicans.
Absolutely. And, it was places like you mentioned Pinellas earlier, Pinellas County with Republican supervisor of election, longtime supervisor there until she retired, Deborah Clark, who was the one who really moved the whole state forward by her innovations, where before this Republican Party started to regulate vote by mail, you had supervisors have a lot of leeway in terms of what they could do. And so she did several things. She put a checkbox on the back of your return envelope saying, hey, would you like to have a vote by mail ballot sent to you in the next election, whether it's a local election or a midterm election, an August primary. And so a lot of people started doing that. So Pinellas County went way above every other county in terms of the percentage of the votes cast that were vote by mail ballots. That was one thing that she had done. She was also the first who started using drop boxes, secure intake stations.
I know.
Called now. It's so Orwellian. And so, we saw
it really is.
Pinellas County reduce a lot of the election day and early voting locations because they had these drop boxes all over the county, which voters could drop off.
Right.
No problems, never a problem. And so the Republican Party started to crack down on that. And we've seen, I haven't done the numbers yet, but I'm sure that vote by mail has tanked in not only Pinellas County, but other places. What's interesting is that voting methods are usually pretty sticky. You get used to going down to your local church on election day to cast your ballot, and a lot of people like seeing their neighbors there. Other people want to do it as convenient as possible. So they're dropping their kids off at school and then hop off to the public library and vote early in person. Or you start voting by mail. Hey, this is pretty easy as long as you can access them. And a lot of people obviously still can. And so you do it that way. Democrats have stuck with that moving to vote by mail. I've written very critically about a lot of the other problems with vote by mail, that a very much higher percentage of vote by mail ballots get rejected.
That's right.
Than if you're voting in person, and it's disproportionately young people, very old people.
I've seen you
Black
do
and
that,
Hispanic.
right?
Yeah. So those numbers are incontrovertible. Those are very sticky numbers. But Democrats have shifted over to that, and you can look at the numbers in this election. About 211,000 more Democrats cast vote by mail ballots than Republicans. And that seemed like a pretty good sign that turnout might not be horrible for Democrats. They were getting their ballots in. Obviously, vote by mail ballots start coming back a lot earlier than early in-person voting starts. And it was consistent across every day of those 30 some odd days of early in-person voting. There were no days in which Democrats returned a higher raw number of vote by mail ballots than Republicans. Then you shift to early in-person voting. And here's early in-person voting, which, remember, in 2011, Republicans tried to kill off. It was the Justice Department that had to intervene, as well as some private groups that had to intervene on this. And Republican early in-person voting on every day except one outran Democrats, criticizing early in-person voting to no end just 13 years ago. And here they are taking advantage of this.
But they're shifting away.
It's too easy. I remember.
Right, too easy. You have to go across the desert. Isn't that
exactly. I was thinking the same thing with Senator Mike Bennett,
who later became the supervisor of elections in Manatee County. Yeah,
I was listening to that.
Yeah,
I actually had again. I have to digress on this because it really is unbelievable. At that time in 2011, when they were working on passing HB 1355, a colleague and I had a big U.S. State Department grant to do cultural exchange with elections officials, voting rights activists, journalists in 6 African countries: Mauritania, Senegal, Chad, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. And we actually had them it was May of 2011 at the University of Florida for a week. When we went up to Tallahassee and met with a lot of folks up there for 3 or 4 days, and then went up to DC. And we were in the middle of a session talking about voting Florida and in the US, mostly focusing in Florida at that time. And of course, they were dumbfounded that, nationally, you don't have a National Election Commission, that you have the AP journalism, journalists calling the election.
Right.
You have my colleague, Mike McDonald, tallying up the total popular vote.
Right.
It's crazy. And they're debating this on the floor. And so I had a journalist, I can't remember who it was, call me up. It was a break that we were having. And we had U.S. State Department translators there, and because these folks all spoke French. And I get a call saying, "Hey, did you hear what Senator Bennett just said on the Senate floor? That Africans walk 200 to 300 miles in the desert just to cast a ballot, that voting is a privilege, not a right." I said, "Well, that's interesting. I happen to have 18 Africans from the desert.
Oh my gosh.
So I'm sure would love to comment
Oh my
on that."
gosh.
And I handed the phone over to the translator and to those participants who just were laughing. I remember one of them saying, I heard the translation, my French isn't that good. We actually have mobile voting stations that go out and find the nomads, the Tuaregs around the desert, to register them to vote.
Oh
and
my
just
gosh.
Unbelievable. But here, they're just demeaning the people who use early in-person voting because it was too easy for them.
I remember that. I covered all that.
Now we have Republicans who are dominating. There were over 1 million more Republicans who voted early in person in Florida this election cycle. So we know that early in-person voting is probably safe this legislative session.
Right.
Probably not going to be a crackdown.
Yeah.
I haven't thought of it, what the loophole might be yet. But so it's remarkable on how strategic the Republican Party is, and how, they are using their resources. They are really, really solid in terms of having a single message, taking the message from the top. In this case, it's been President Trump for the last, what is it, 8, 12 years now? My God, who knows? It's timeless. And taking that message and being focused on that message. And if you deviate from the message, we are banishing you. We're putting you down into the basement of the state capitol, or we're going to campaign against you in primaries. They are disciplined. And the other thing that I think is really important is that the Democratic Party relies on groups to deliver their message. And those groups are not always on the same page. They have different messages. You were talking earlier about the Amendment 4 proponents. They spent a lot of money to get that on the ballot, they did a lot of work to try to keep it nonpartisan.
That's right.
And they did. They succeeded. 57% of the vote. You don't get there in Florida unless it's bipartisan. You're getting folks from across the divide to vote for it. But it hurts then the ability, again, to use that message for the political party that could benefit from it.
Right.
If people, going back to that first thing we were talking about, are thinking issues and issue ownership to be able to drive support for party and those parties' candidates because of those issues on the ballot.
I actually was unsure about nationally who would win the presidential race until I looked at the Pinellas County on election night. Even that late, I felt all along like President Trump would win. I haven't been big for a variety of reasons. People who know me know, like, I broke my leg and then I broke my wrist. And so I haven't been traveling around the state a lot. I haven't been talking to people a lot. But I go by the Comcast guy comes in. I don't follow politics. I'm not interested in politics. And then you mention DeSantis or Trump, and they say, "Oh, I love DeSantis. I love Trump." So I'm just like, again, anecdotally, I felt like President Trump would probably win. And I did think both ballot initiatives would go down. Were you surprised at the now I had no idea that the governor was going to do what he did, come out so in an unprecedented campaign with the use of multiple state agencies and agency heads and really electioneering against these amendments. I was in a conversation with Senator Blazin Golia, who has been the sponsor of a lot of the legislation you're talking about, a former Republican Party of Florida chairman. And he said it's not advocacy. He didn't call what the governor's doing advocacy. It's educating voters, informing them about what's on the ballot. I think I'm predicting right here and now that we are going to see some changes to the ballot initiative process, maybe not just the initiative, but the proposed, the way constitutional amendments are handled. One of the things he mentioned to me, and I haven't written about it yet, so people are going to maybe hear about this on Sunday when this comes out, is doing away with the ballot summary. And I asked him if you could do that, if that would require a constitutional amendment. He said he thinks that you can do that legislatively. You're, sort of visually scratching your head. You're pondering this. This was just yesterday. He said this to me. You're the ballot initiative guy. I've been covering these for a long time. I think we're going to see some changes. The governor was very unhappy that these two proposals even made it to the ballot with his Supreme Court that has a majority of justices appointed by him. What says you about potential? I mean, we haven't even finished doing the autopsy of the election, but we're doing the weave. Let's do the weave.
Yeah, look, we've been doing the weave pretty well.
Yes.
I think our Florida man would be pretty impressed.
Thank you.
With his weave with this. So, look, I would say it's a non-zero chance, and yet the chances are less in terms of reforming, quote unquote, the initiative process, regulating it to death, one might say as well, than if Amendments 3 and 4 had passed, or one of them had passed.
Right.
The fact that they didn't pass may give a little pause, but let's just think about what the underlying dynamic is here. Lawmakers and the governor have monopoly power over the legislative process. They have supermajorities, they have mandates, and they can basically do whatever they want legislatively.
Republican lawmakers.
Republican lawmakers.
Yeah.
But the same is true in places like California, where it's Democrats.
Right.
Who also have a much longer long-standing initiative process going back to the adoption in 1912. And I can tell you, because I've looked historically at the regulation of the initiative process, it's bipartisan. And it has to do with who's controlling the reins of government in state legislative capitals, because they don't like the possibility of a median voter turning over policy that they control. And so, yes, there is certainly a dynamic there that they don't like the initiative process. It's tempered a little, I think, because these measures did go down to defeat. I don't think we're going to see any legislation saying that state resources can't be used on ballot initiatives. But that was remarkable. It was mind-blowing that tens of millions of our taxpayer dollars that were used to campaign against these two issues, Amendments 3 and 4.
I mean, maybe it was mind-blowing, Dan, because we've never seen anyone do it before.
Yeah.
And now we've set a precedent. So will we expect that to take place in the future? I don't know. I mean, I think there was one senator, Senator Gruters, who was endorsed by President Trump for a race that is for CFO in 2 years, I think, who was a proponent of Amendment 3, the recreational marijuana amendment. And he has said we need to look at whether we want an accounting for how much state dollars were used. And this was not legislative appropriated for that purpose. But the way that the governor and his lawyers are very smart. It would not surprise me if they did it in such a way that would have met whatever requirements for spending that would not have been illegal. So I'm just saying you might want some folks who might get an accounting. I think, the fact of the matter is that the legislature put 4 amendments on that ballot, proposals, and only 2 of them passed.
Right. And they weren't the
And they all got over
ones.
50%.
Yeah, they all did. Well, I was just going to say, if Senator Gruters continues that line of argument, you're going to have to walk down the steps in the state capitol to find his office because he's not going to have a view.
Well, you might be right, although he did just today get appointed to a high-profile position by Senate President Ben Albritton. So I don't know. I mean, we'll have to do another podcast on what the outcome of the election means in terms of who's more powerful, President Trump and Donald.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Ron
this morning, waking up.
DeSantis.
We got a lame duck governor.
Right. How lame is he, though? He killed these 2 constitutional amendments.
Sure he did, but you've got a lot
including one that the president-elect supported.
Yeah. Well, we don't know. And when he actually came out of the polling booth, he wouldn't say how he voted, even though he said he was going
on
to
pot?
support. No, this was Amendment 4.
I'm talking on pot, though. He did come out and say he was going to vote for that, and he encouraged people to vote for that. Yes.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. No, look, it is a completely different podcast, and you have folks in the Tallahassee who are much more situated than I am, but it's a wonderful thing to think about in terms of all of these egos that are gearing up to run for these constitutional offices. And wow, that's really the only saving grace for Democrats ever these days, is when the Republican Party becomes split. And it's not split ideologically anymore. It used to be. Remember when Senator Jim King?
Yes, I do remember. Yes.
These other folks who were kind of moderates. They were fiscally conservative, but socially fairly moderate, and they were the ones who could kind of steer the legislation. Or when you had the egos of the House and the Senate, you still have those egos, but they're all kind of ideologically in lockstep right now. And so the only way that you're going to have anything not passed from a Democratic perspective is if you start having the positioning for 2026.
What do you do with the Democrats now with this performance in Florida? How do you get, we already heard this year there was a contraction of investment from out of state, funders. How do you remain relevant? What is their path to try to eat into the supermajority or win a statewide race? Do they have one?
I don't think they have one at this point. In some ways, if you were thinking nationally, you would want to open up the flow from all of these battleground states, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina. If I was a billionaire, giving people free rent, free housing, free mortgages, if they can prove that they are a reliable Republican and want to move down to Florida, to the free state of Florida. That's the cynical view, but in some ways, let Florida
get them out of the swing states and put them into the swamp. Put them into the swamp
here. The villages, it's expanding, but there's a lot more space there. You can still go way more further south or I-70, the turnpike.
So plenty of more room for golf carts in the villages.
Exactly. Just come on down. The STDs really aren't that bad. Let's.
I don't know. We're going to do away with vaccines, so maybe they might be worse in 5 years.
That's the cynical position. I honestly don't know what the Democratic Party is going to do. You don't see much light right now. As I said earlier, though, it depends on what the next 2 years bear in D.C. and whether the wheels just fall off and people are suffering even more. There are some districts that are somewhat competitive, winning statewide. I don't see that happening anytime soon, and it's largely because of the shift in terms of the voter registration margins, but more importantly, just the lack of turnout. There is just not much that a lot of folks in Florida who might be positionally in favor of Democratic policies to vote for at this point.
What
and
are...
I don't mean to move to the, I don't think the Democratic Party can move to the left. That's been part of the problem. You look at the ads.
I was just going to ask you that.
Okay.
I was just going to ask you that. Is it, I feel like people voted in Florida, the things that I hear people talking about, it's the price of bacon. If you're a vegetarian, it's the price of eggs. Well, maybe that's okay. You know what I mean? The price of butter. And I don't care how much money you make. If you bought a pound of bacon and it was $4 last year or whatever, I don't know, I don't buy bacon, but if it was $4 last year and it's $10 this year, you notice it, even if you can afford it. And property insurance.
Yeah.
And people are really pissed off about how much their property insurance costs. And if they own a rental property, they don't know how much it's going to cost next year. And that's disconcerting for folks. So that's what I'm hearing. I'm not hearing people talking about even the abortion issue as much, or transgender rights, or any of the identity politics issues that now Democrats seem to have, Republicans have always been good at framing the narrative. Always. In my career, they have been great at that. And now this is kind of like how they've branded the Democratic Party. Like, they want to give you abortion on demand until birth, and they want boys to play in girls' sports. I mean, and I'm not condoning that. That is not my take on what it means. I'm just saying this is their talking points, and a lot of people, those messages resonate with. And, oh, by the way, don't tell me there's a global economic situation going on because of the pandemic and we're doing better than they're doing in Europe, because I don't give a damn. I only know that my groceries cost more and it's the guy in the White House's fault.
Yeah, those pocketbook issues are something that the Democrats should be able to capitalize on. I mean, especially in Florida, the housing insurance, the housing costs, something that the Republicans own. And yet Democrats haven't been able to make that stick, and it gets, we used to have Willie Horton back in 1988, right?
Yeah.
And so that's still there, but there are so many other issues now that Republicans can go to kind of put these wedges in that Democratic coalition. And that tent is so broad. It has so many issues. We can think about it with respect to the war in Gaza and, and now beyond, where Kamala Harris really tried to thread a needle, but
really hard.
There wasn't even the thread was not even strong enough to go through that hole because she was so weak on what position, and so she gets wiped out in Dearborn, Michigan.
Yeah,
and she loses Pennsylvania. And I honestly don't think whether a different running mate would have made any difference on that. It's just really difficult to keep that broad coalition that actually cares about these issues, and they care about issues that aren't always on the same side within that party, whereas opposed to the Republican Party is really good at just saying, oh, you know what, I'm a Christian. He's not really a Christian, but he's going to defend Christian rights. It's a completely different way of thinking about what the party is and what the party leadership is, as opposed to the Democratic Party. And I think that's something that's going to be very difficult. I mean, these pocketbook issues, things about housing insurance, property taxes going up.
Mm-hmm.
These are things that should be owned by the state legislature and by Ron DeSantis, and the Democrats can't make that stick for whatever reason. I have no idea why that messaging seems to fall flat, but it's a lot easier just to talk about boys playing girls sports.
I mean, again, it's too soon to see the data. Do you have any other big takeaways from turnout and either the way people voted or where they voted or didn't vote from Tuesday night?
As I was saying earlier, this was a uniform shift. We saw it across all counties in Florida. We saw it across all jurisdictions where Trump did better. Rick Scott did better. Rick Scott, a guy who can barely win an election, did the best he's ever done. And it wasn't in one area in particular. If you look at Miami-Dade, for instance, I can't remember what the shift was, something like a 29-point shift from Clinton to Trump and then another 11 points with Trump to Harris. So that's a 40-point shift from 2016, where Clinton beat Trump by 29 points in Miami-Dade. Trump beats Harris by 11 points. A 40-point shift. And you think, what's the cause of that? In a decade. That's insane. And that's not just Cubans coming out in force, although they did. It's not just Cuban Americans voting for Trump, which they did. It's also meaning a lot of other folks in the county didn't turn out to vote who might have voted for the Democratic candidate. And there are people, no party affiliates without question, younger no party affiliates, because I can see that from the data, who were turning out in Miami-Dade, much more so than other counties that have sizable Hispanic populations. The turnout, I put this together looking at turnout. Turnout wasn't massive in Miami-Dade. The numbers I have right now, Miami-Dade's overall turnout was only about 72%, and all the numbers aren't in. But Orange County was around 72%. Osceola was around 74%. So it's not just the turnout, it's who turned out. And those are among the bottom of turnout for the state. And that's out of, the denominator there is active voters, not all voters. But whatever, it's pretty good gauge. Turnout wasn't massive in Miami-Dade, which means that two things are happening. One, certain demographics aren't turning out to vote, and those that did are changing their preferences. And I think that is something that the Democratic Party has to really grapple with in terms of where is the Hispanic voice? Where was people who were like stars? Remember Javier Jose Rodriguez?
Yes.
Democratic star. You knew he was going to be running for governor after he won that Senate race in 2020.
Lost by 32
and lost
votes.
by 32 votes.
And they
a lot of shenanigans.
Yeah, very much.
Shenanigans with the ghost candidate.
Yeah.
But, here was someone who knew how to talk about issues. Remember, he would walk around in his white
those boots. Yeah.
Before Ron DeSantis tried to co-opt him.
Right. Again, deadpan Dan.
So he was this progressive, a real, true progressive voice.
Yes.
And got crossover votes.
Yes.
And so, and then Republicans realized that they needed to take him out. And whether or not that the ghost candidate, Alex Rodriguez, winded up getting around 6,000 votes. And as you said, lost by 32 votes at the recount. I've done some analysis of it. I'm not sure that was the deal breaker.
Interesting.
Even that close.
Really?
There was
interesting.
A lot of there were a lot of no party affiliates who split their vote for the top of the ticket for Trump and for, say, Donna Shalala.
Right.
Who's voting for Donald Trump and Donna Shalala?
It's weird.
It's weird, but these people
Miami-Dade, the 305 is its own.
It is its own place, man. It's worldwide, and those voters who split their tickets, either Biden and Salazar, or Trump and Donna Shalala, they were disproportionately likely to vote for the third party candidate because clearly party didn't matter to them. They were truly no party affiliates. They weren't just, hidden partisans, no party affiliates who are really true Republicans or Democrats. So there's a lot that's going on there. But Rodriguez, JJR, had a real pulse on how to talk issues and get that Democratic support. I don't know where it is now in terms of the Hispanic community. In South Florida, much less the rest of the Florida. Where is it in Central Florida? I mean, our member of Congress, Soto, Republicans are very smart in terms of not putting a lot of money into these areas where it could generate turnout in a competitive election where they don't want people then voting up ballot.
Yeah.
And so we see that. You look at all the...
That's actually hits on kind of the reverse of what I was going to ask you about. Nikki Fried made a decision to run a Democrat in every legislative seat, every legislative race. Did that turn out to bite them in the ass?
Interesting dilemma. And it's one that I've been really trying to wrap my head around, and I haven't done research on this yet, but I've always been of the opinion when you are not running candidates top to bottom, that you are diminishing the mobilization for getting people out to vote. I mean, I remember when I moved to Florida, first election I voted in was in 2002. And it was the November election. I just started at the University of Florida. And
That was a midterm.
it was a midterm. And I walked in
Because I know this because I covered the recount, so I know that was a midterm.
Exactly. So 2002, I'm in there and I went to vote and I said, there's a problem with my ballot. I said, no, I don't think so, sir. I said, no, there's no one running for U.S. Congress. I know it's a midterm election, but they're elected every 2 years. And the poll worker said, well, that's because Corinne Brown doesn't have an opponent. And that was when I first realized, in Florida is different.
Right.
When you don't have anyone else who is
Right.
filing, and she didn't have anyone file in the primary or in the Republican Party and the Democrat. There was no write-in candidate.
That was before they started with the write-in stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That it's like, and so there you take at the time, very popular member of Congress. She's elected first African American, along with Carrie Meek in 1992 in Florida. She's very popular from that Jacksonville to Orlando in that snaky District 5 that went all the way down. And you've basically taken away her ability to raise money, because you can't raise money if you don't have an election. You've taken away her voice in terms of out campaigning, particularly in African American neighborhoods, which this was disproportionately packed with as part of the gerrymandering that happened after the 2000 election. And so you've effectively minimized the type of mobilization that could be coming from, besides the top of the ticket, from other races. Now, Nikki Fried's strategy, as you were mentioning, was to say, we're going to change that around. We're going to put candidates on all these. You notice Republicans didn't do that. And so you still had Democrats who were maybe quote unquote running across all of these districts, but they had nominal or no Republican.
Right.
Opposition.
Carlos Guillermo Smith is a good example
exactly.
of that.
Guillermo Smith, here's again, Central Florida, one of the stronger voices that we were talking about, and a potential future leader.
Very progressive.
Very progressive. And why give him a voice?
Right.
He's going to win his district. Why put a candidate up there where he's going to be able to go out and campaign in a way in which is going to help mobilize people to the polls who are not necessarily that excited about maybe Kamala Harris?
And that was my question then. By doing this in some of these what are really safe Republican seats, did you help the Republican, do you help the top of the ticket? Do you help, against the amendments, or I don't know. I don't know the answer. That's why I'm asking you.
And this is one of those things that I'm planning on studying.
Okay, I know it's 2 days after the election, so.
It's a really interesting one.
Yeah.
I've got a couple other projects that try to. There's we call it an identification problem. You really have to be able to identify very closely what does that affect. How do you measure that effect? And so what you really want to be doing is, for instance, taking the district in which they're running in and find the precincts that are, say, on one side of a competitive district versus the precincts that have no candidate. Then be able to kind of look and match across these precincts the type of people who are actually turning out to vote or not. Yeah. Because that allows you to drill down to say whether or not certain groups of people are turning out because of the competitiveness or the lack thereof. But yeah, the Republicans have definitely taken the strategy of, it's yours, Democrats, right. Have fun.
Well, let me ask you, and again, thank you so much. It's always fun, and we'll get you back. Pinky swear you'll come back after you get some of this analysis done, because I'm sure you'll find a lot of stuff that we'll want to talk about. But before we go, 2 very high profile, very expensive proposed constitutional amendments. True Leave alone spent almost $150 million, almost all. I think I did the calculation. I think they spent 94% of what was spent in favor of the amendment. $150 million. I think it's probably in the range of $150 million on the pro side. On the abortion amendment, I don't know what the numbers are. I know that Governor Ron DeSantis's committees raised collectively about $30 million. I'm sure that much more than that was spent. That's not including state funds. The point I'm making is it's a very expensive process. It's a high threshold, 60%. Do you think this is the end of the road for citizen initiatives or ballot initiatives in Florida?
Yeah, I think this was the last gasp, quite honestly. There are so many hurdles already in place, from the 10% threshold to qualify just to have a hearing before the state Supreme Court to work on whether or not the title and the summary are going to be acceptable, to the distribution requirements of signatures, to the restrictions.
That means that you have to have so many from so many different congressional districts.
Correct. And I've heard this talk about doing it at the county level, but that's against a one person, one vote. Congressional districts all have the same number of people, and that's why they do it in terms of over a certain number of congressional districts. To the limits on signature gatherers, can't be paid by the signature. It has to be at the hourly rate. That makes it more difficult to recruit and to hire people. To the Office of Crimes and
Election
Crimes and Security. Going after not only the signature gatherers, but harassing voters who are signing petitions, having people knock at their door and say, "Did you really sign it?"
With a dossier, with a 15-page dossier. Yeah.
What the hell is that?
Yeah.
Honestly, that is mind-blowing. And so you have all these things already in process, to say nothing of the 60% plus one threshold, that makes it difficult for people to come in. Now you have these incredibly high-profile spending measures in favor. These were, in one, it was more a corporate entity, but I don't have any problem with that. Corporations lobby all the time. They spend millions of dollars lobbying that this is over 100 million.
They spend hundreds of millions of dollars on campaigns too for candidates.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes. So I'm not at all surprised. And again, as a scholar who's looked historically at the initiative process, in Denver, Colorado, in the first initiative in Colorado back in 1912, they were paying 3 cents a signature to qualify in measures. 1912.
Wow.
Right? So this is nothing new, but the efforts to kill them off and having to just have a silver bullet or two that's going to raise doubt and only needing a minority of the voters, only 40%, to say, no, I don't think so. I think it's pretty much dead, regardless of whether or not Ron DeSantis and the Republican legislature decide to legislate it with 1,000 more cuts this coming session.
Okay. Well, I usually have a fun question. Last week it came out it was daylight savings time. I asked, daylight savings time, yay or nay?
I love getting up in the morning when it's dark. So whichever of those two does that, I'm into it.
Okay, see, I can never figure out. The person I had last week was like, I don't know, I like this way, I like that. Just pick one way and
I don't know whether
stick
we're
with
in daylight savings now or not. Are we back to standard time?
Stick with it. Are you watching anything on Netflix? Let's ask that question.
I have not watched anything. I haven't watched any cable news. Well, I don't have cable. I don't watch it. I'm pretty boring.
You're not boring. You're the least boring. Well, listen, I'm going to come back. Next time I'll have 3 extra fun questions. University of Florida political science professor, very much enjoyed our conversation. Dan Smith, thanks so much for joining me today.
Anytime. It was a true pleasure, and it went by way too quick.
Thanks for listening to Deeper Dive with Dara, a podcast by the News Service of Florida, hosted by News Service senior writer Dara Cam and produced by me, Mike Exline. Music for the podcast was recorded by Periodic Labs, LLC. To tell us what you'd like to hear, what you've thought about the podcast so far, or even just mention how awesome we are, we have a new email address and we'd love to hear from you.
That's right. We'd love to hear from you. Email us at podcasts with an S at e.newsserviceflorida.com. I know it's a mouthful, but it's podcasts with an S at e.newsserviceflorida.com.